The phone hit the pavement before the bystander finished the sentence he was recording. It cracked across the screen in a spiderweb pattern, the camera app still glowing faintly beneath the shattered glass, and Patrol Officer Gavin Rourke looked down at it the way a man looks at a problem he believes he has just solved. The bystander who had been holding it, a teenager in a delivery uniform, backed away without a word, hands raised, his afternoon suddenly narrowed down to whatever Rourke decided to do next. He believed the evidence was gone. He was wrong. 20 feet away, on a weathered bench beside the Hawthorne Park fountain, two women in faded municipal work clothes sat without moving. Special Agent Simone Carter, 43, kept her hands loose in her lap, a paper lunch bag beside her on the slats. Special Agent Talia Brooks, 36, sat closer to a battered electrical toolbox resting against the bench leg, its clasps worn silver from years of real use. Inside it were ordinary tools, a set of valid work orders, a compact camera angled through a gap in the lid, an encrypted transmitter, and a spare battery. The toolbox had been assembled to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny. Real wear on the hinges, a receipt from a hardware store folded into a side pocket. Nothing that would look staged to anyone who bothered to look closely, which was precisely the point. Neither woman looked afraid, and it was their stillness, more than anything else, that pulled Rourke's attention away from the broken phone and across the grass toward the bench. He walked over with the loose, unhurried gait of someone who had never once been questioned for approaching a stranger. "You two got a problem?" he asked. Simone rose slowly, unbothered, and met his eyes. "No, officer," she said, "but you just created one." The bench was the planned handoff point in a federal operation 9 months in the making. Its purpose was narrow. Receive an encrypted index from a source inside Belridge PD, confirm her safety, and get her out of the park. Simone and Talia were not supposed to be detained, searched, or taken anywhere. In a surveillance van 4 blocks away, Task Force Supervisor Camille Hayes watched 2 screens at once, one tracking the source, one tracking the bench, because the operational plan had always treated Marion Wells's safety as the first priority, ahead of the handoff itself. At the far edge of the park, a woman in jogging clothes crossed the path near the tree line, a silver key fob pressed flat against her palm. Marion Wells kept her stride even, her eyes forward, carrying inside that small piece of metal and plastic more than a year of quiet, dangerous work. Records copied a few pages at a time during slow shifts. A memory of every barcode she'd noticed didn't match the shipment it claimed to belong to. The fob itself held an encrypted index and file hashes, a map to the evidence rather than the evidence itself. The original sat untouched on a server Marion could still reach. If it fell into the wrong hands before the handoff, the case would survive. That was by design. Behind her, at a careful distance, Sergeant Colin Voss followed with the kind of patience that suggested he already knew exactly where she was going. The exchange between Marion and the 2 women on the bench was supposed to take 4 seconds. Across the city, in a holding cell that smelled of bleach and old coffee, a man named Andre Coleman sat with his hands folded, watching a wall clock tick toward 5 o'clock. The hour his transfer to a contract detention facility would make every legal option in front of him immeasurably harder to reach. He had already stopped expecting anyone to look at his file closely enough to notice what didn't add up, and had started instead on the smaller task of memorizing his daughter's last phone call in case it needed to last him a while. Rourke ordered both women to stand. Simone was already standing. Talia stayed seated, her eyes tracking Marion's slow progress across the grass without turning her head. "What are we being accused of, officer?" Simone asked. Rourke didn't answer the question so much as ignore it. He pointed at the toolbox. "Open it," he said. Talia looked up at him, calm, unhurried. "Do you have consent, a warrant, probable cause, or a specific safety basis?" she asked. "I'm not asking twice," Rourke said. "Then I'm not opening it," Talia said. "Not without one of those." Rourke's jaw tightened. "Women like you don't get to decide that," he said. Low enough that it might have passed for private if the toolbox camera hadn't already been recording every syllable, and sending it in short bursts to the surveillance van 4 blocks away. He saw in that moment only a black woman refusing an order, and nothing underneath it. Not the calm in her voice, not the precision of her question, nothing that might have told him he was the one currently being evaluated. Marion kept walking. Voss kept following. Rourke reached out and closed his hand around Simone's wrist. Her training answered before her thoughts did. A shift of weight, a rotation that could have put him flat on the grass in under 2 seconds. And she felt the shape of that outcome open up in front of her and closed it just as fast. Because behind Rourke, 30 yards off, Voss was still watching Marion, and a struggle here would end the operation before it had a chance to matter. She let her arm go loose. "We are not resisting," she said. Rourke mistook the stillness for surrender. He shoved her against the bench edge and pulled her wrists behind her, the cuffs closing tight enough to bite. Talia stepped forward, and he forced her down beside Simone, looping a second set of cuffs over her wrist without checking it, the steel settling directly across an old injury that had never fully healed. "That's pressing on a joint," Talia said evenly. "Can you adjust it?" Rourke tightened it instead. A man near the fountain lifted his phone to record. A woman pushing a stroller slowed and stared. An older man walking a dog said, quietly but clearly, that he'd seen the whole thing and would be glad to say so to anyone who asked. Rourke kept his grip on both women and reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I've got 2 suspicious females, non-compliant, possible theft crew, requesting backup at Hawthorne Park." Before dispatch could finish logging the call, another voice cut across the channel, calm, authoritative, unmistakably senior. "Hold your field report," the voice said. "Do not search them in public. Bring them to Precinct 9. Use the restricted service entrance. Delay entering their names until they're inside." Rourke frowned at his radio but didn't argue with a deputy chief. Simone recognized the shape of the mistake immediately. A deputy chief did not personally intervene in a routine park detention unless something about it already worried him. Someone at the top of Belridge PD knew, or feared, that this contact was connected to something larger and was trying to keep it off the record before it became one. It was, she thought, the clearest signal the case had produced in months. Not a document, not a wiretap, just a man with too much rank reaching for a radio a beat too fast. She caught Talia's eye for half a second, a look that carried a single decision. They would let this happen. The plan they were now following wasn't invented on the bench. Months earlier, the operation had built a standing contingency for exactly this scenario, unexpected escalation involving command staff. And it came with hard limits Camille could enforce from the van without either agent saying a word. A live audio feed, GPS on both agents, a panic signal built into the transmitter in Simone's badge, and an arrest team close enough to move in minutes. Not the original handoff plan, but a plan all the same. The threshold for hard intervention was explicit. A weapon drawn on either agent, loss of the audio feed, either agent moved outside the transmitter's range, or Marion going dark, and until one of those lines was crossed, continuing gave them a direct link to whoever had just spoken into that radio, a link the case had been missing for months. The transmitters were live. Marion's safety still came first, and whoever had just spoken into that radio might be the direct link the case had been missing for months. As Rourke walked them toward his patrol car, Marion passed within a few feet of the bench and let the silver key fob slip from her fingers into the grass beneath it without breaking stride. Voss crouched, retrieved it in one motion, and peeled off toward the park's south exit, already dialing a number on his phone. From the surveillance van, Camille watched both movements happen 11 seconds apart and marked the timestamp. Not a loss, but a lead. Whoever Voss called next, and whatever he did with an index that pointed at evidence he couldn't actually alter from a phone in his pocket, would tell them more than the fob itself ever could. Rourke put a hand on top of each woman's head and folded them into the back of his patrol car. "You're under arrest," he told Simone through the open door. "You're taking this further than you understand," she said. He didn't understand what she meant, and didn't try to. The drive was short. Talia noticed through the mesh partition that they weren't heading toward the public intake entrance at all, but toward a ramp descending beneath Precinct 9 into a garage lit by sodium lamps that turned everything the color of old rust. Deputy Chief Leonard Vale was waiting beside the elevator when the car stopped. A man whose face had appeared at 3 different city press conferences that year, discussing transparency and reform, a man who had once stood at a podium and used the word accountability so often a local reporter had joked about it afterward. Sergeant Voss stood beside him, the silver key fob still in his hand. No booking officer met the vehicle. No arrest report was opened. No property inventory began. Vale looked at Rourke with an anger that had nothing to do with the women in the back seat. "You almost searched them in the open," he said, in front of a crowd, with phones out. It was, Simone understood as she was walked toward the elevator, not a concern about procedure. It was a concern about what might have been photographed before he controlled the location. In an unmonitored side office, 2 officers went through the agent's bags and pockets, working quickly, unaware they were only finding what had been left for them to find. Both agents had gone into the park carrying nothing that would put a corrupt precinct in possession of a live federal weapon. Talia's sidearm was a legally registered piece tied to her cover identity, cleared in advance for exactly the frisk that followed, and nothing recovered that day carried a classified marking or operational detail beyond the cover itself. The office still had a coffee maker on the counter from a shift change earlier that day, and one of the officers moved it aside without a second thought to set down the confiscated phone, as if the ordinariness of the room made anything happening inside it ordinary too. They took Talia's sidearm. They took Simone's encrypted phone, a small communications receiver, and a folder of municipal cover documents. They did not find either woman's federal credentials, sealed in separate concealed compartments never opened. They did not notice that the plain plastic identification badge clipped to Simone's collar carried, inside its lamination, a low-power audio transmitter capable of sending short packets of sound to a receiver 2 blocks away. Nothing more, no picture, no map, nothing that belonged in a different kind of story. Vale walked Simone into a small interrogation room and reached up to the camera mounted in the corner, switching it off with 2 fingers. "There's no record you were ever in this building," he told her. The transmitter kept working. The threat left the room anyway, carried on radio waves he didn't know existed. In the van, Camille logged the moment the camera cut out as the first line crossed. Not yet a hard intervention trigger on its own, but close enough that she moved the arrest team from standby to staged, 4 blocks becoming 2. He separated the 2 women without explanation, sending Talia down a side corridor with Rourke while he pulled a chair across from Simone and sat. Rourke walked Talia into an old storage room lined with broken chairs and secured her cuffed wrist to a fixed pipe bracket at the wall. "Comfortable?" he asked, watching her flinch as the metal pressed the old injury. He left without waiting for an answer. Alone, Talia worked her injured wrist against a flat metal shim sewn into the lining of her waistband. Standard issue for this kind of operation. Nothing built into the cuffs themselves. Her fingers clumsy from the ache radiating up her forearm, the process slower and more painful than she would have liked, until the lock finally gave. She flexed her hand twice, testing it, filing the pain away somewhere she could deal with later, and moved to the door. In the interrogation room, Simone let the silence stretch before she spoke. "The March shipment," she said, almost idly. 14 kilos, moved on the 9th. "It was the 11th, Vale said, correcting her before he could stop himself. He heard his own voice a half-second too late and understood exactly what he had just confirmed. Simone didn't smile. She simply noted it, the way she noted the duplicated evidence barcode buried in Andre Coleman's case file, the disabled warehouse cameras, the deleted body camera footage, and the fact that every piece of that erased trail ran through credentials belonging to Gavin Rourke. "If this collapses," she said quietly, "you're going to need someone below you to have done it alone." Vale's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He talked, the way proud men talk when they believe they are still in control of the room. About audits he had survived, internal investigations that had gone nowhere, an internal affairs investigator he'd once found easy to redirect. He never said the words, "I did it." He didn't have to. Simone let him talk, offering nothing but the occasional nod, aware that every sentence he considered a demonstration of his own cleverness was, to her, simply one more brick in a wall he was building against himself. Down the corridor, Talia moved past a closed door and heard a voice behind it, muffled, restrained, unmistakably afraid. Inside, she found Marion bound to a metal chair and Voss seated at a laptop nearby, working through the recovered key fobs directory while a document sat open on the screen. A confession, typed in Marion's name, claiming she had stolen narcotics, falsified records, turned violent under routine questioning, and injured herself while alone in custody. The file's properties, visible in a corner of the screen, showed it had been created under Voss's own login 20 minutes earlier, built from a template used in 2 prior cases, and queued twice already to a printer down the hall. A document with its own paper trail, built by the men who thought paper trails only worked one way. Voss stepped out to take a call. Talia moved fast and quiet. He was still mid-sentence into the phone when she reached him, using the doorframe for leverage against her weakened wrist. He got a hand up, and the struggle cost her 3 seconds, and a fresh ache through the old injury before she had him face down, Marion pressing a knee between his shoulder blades to help hold him there. She freed Marion's wrists. "The directory's damaged," Marion said, breathing hard, looking at the laptop. He was trying to force it open. Her hands were shaking slightly, an after effect she seemed almost annoyed by, as though her body hadn't gotten the message yet that the immediate danger had passed. "Is there another copy?" Talia asked. "A server account," Marion said. "It's read-only, archive access only. They never fully closed it out when they moved me to records, because the contractor only syncs credentials overnight. I still have the recovery code memorized. Combined with his card, it should get us into the room." They took Voss's access card and moved through a service door into a room lined with server racks, the air cold and humming, a wall of small green lights blinking in patient rows. Voss's card opened the physical door. It went no further than that. At an isolated terminal, Marion entered her own archive login, then the recovery code she'd carried in her memory for exactly this reason. 2 separate credentials, neither of them enough alone, both required to reach anything that mattered. Marion began pulling files in the order that mattered most. Andre Coleman's evidence record came first, then the warehouse access logs, then the authorization that had disabled the cameras the night the narcotics disappeared, then fragments of body camera footage, then the label history showing the same evidence tag duplicated onto 2 different case numbers. Then, last, an exchange of messages between Vale and Voss, time-stamped across nearly a year, casual in tone, in a way that made the content underneath them feel colder rather than more dramatic. A progress bar crawled across the screen, and neither woman spoke while it moved. The only sound in the room, the low hum of cooling fans, and, somewhere beneath it, Marion's breathing, still uneven from the chair, and the tape marks, still faintly visible at her wrists. The warehouse logs showed Voss entering the building while officially off-duty. The camera authorization record carried Vale's administrative credential. A recovered fragment placed Rourke beside Andre Coleman's car in the same frame where Voss could be seen carrying an evidence bag toward it. The cocaine listed in Andre's arrest report had been logged into warehouse inventory hours before his arrest ever happened. 12 separate body camera deletions were attributed to Rourke's login, several of them time-stamped for moments when he had been working an entirely different call across town. Marion sent the Andre Coleman files to the federal prosecutor's emergency line the second they finished downloading. In the van, Camille had already moved once on the dead interrogation camera. The moment Vale's own words, "There's no record you were ever in this building," reached her over the transmitter, confirming unrecorded custody in progress, that was the second and final threshold. She gave the order to move. The arrest team was already coming through the outer gate, warrant in hand, when the server room door opened 2 floors below. That was when the door opened, and Rourke stepped into the server room, having found the empty storage room, and followed the only hallway that made sense. His weapon came partway from the holster before he seemed to remember where he was. Talia moved between him and Marion without raising her hands, without raising her voice. "Your login deleted 12 body camera files," she said, "including 3 timestamped for calls you weren't even on. That's not." Rourke started. "There's an audio file," she said. "Vale telling Voss that if investigators got close, your record would make you easy to believe." Rourke's face didn't move for a long moment. He had spent 2 years assuming Vale kept him close because Vale respected what he was willing to do. He remembered, now, all the times Vale had waved off a complaint against him, with a comment about loyalty, and how good that had felt at the time, how little he had questioned why a deputy chief would bother protecting a patrol officer with his record, unless it served some purpose of his own. He understood now, standing in the cold hum of that server room, that he had been kept close for exactly the opposite reason, because a man with his history was easy to sacrifice. "Lower it," Talia said. "Help us protect what's on that server. Tell investigators what he ordered you to do." For one full breath, something in his posture loosened, like a man deciding to put a weight down. Then his eyes went to the terminal, to the files still copying, and fear did what pride hadn't managed. He lunged past Talia toward the rack and slammed the emergency power cutoff. The lights died. The hum stopped. The progress bar froze mid-transfer, and for one terrible second, Talia thought everything was gone. Then a small green light near the base of the rack blinked awake on its own, steady, independent, drawing power from somewhere the main system couldn't touch. "Battery mirror," Marion said, her voice hoarse in the dark. "State records law made the city put one in after the last breach. Run by an outside vendor, not the department. Vale thought he'd had the account disabled months ago. He never found out the audit channel underneath it was still live. The files are already copying out to a server this building doesn't control." The shutdown itself had triggered a tampering alert, sent automatically the moment main power dropped mid-transfer, racing out to the FBI task force, the federal prosecutor, and an independent oversight office before anyone in that basement could stop it. Rourke hadn't erased the evidence. He had created another authenticated record, this time of the attempt to destroy it. His hand moved back toward the weapon at his hip, and Talia closed the distance and took it before it cleared the holster, turning him, checking the space between the cuffs and his wrist before locking them. "This is restraint for safety," she said. "Pain is not the purpose." In the interrogation room upstairs, a message reached Vale's phone, and his face changed as he read it. He stood. Simone stood with him. Her own cuffs had been fastened in a hurry and never double-locked. She'd worked one wrist loose while he talked, patient, waiting for a moment worth using it, and stayed seated only because he was still talking. She set a small leather case on the table and opened it. "Special Agent Simone Carter," she said. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." "No one knows you're here," Vale said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "They do now," she said, touching the plain badge still clipped to her collar. "Everything you said in this room, they heard." Outside, engines were already approaching, headlights sweeping the garage entrance, the same team that had been staged at the gate since the interrogation camera went dark, arriving now because a warrant already covering the precinct's evidence systems had just gained the exigent circumstance it needed to execute early. A civilian source in danger and a federal agent confirmed, held with no record of her presence. Vale's hand moved toward a concealed weapon at his hip, and Simone closed the distance and controlled his arm before it cleared his jacket, walking him back into the chair with the same economy of motion Talia had used 2 floors below. Federal agents came through the precinct under that warrant, Evidence Preservation Authority, and the emergency circumstances that had just triggered. Camille Hayes moved through the building, giving instructions in a voice that expected no argument. the same voice that had been coordinating the operation from the van since the bench. Vale was secured. Rourke was secured. Voss was secured. Marion was walked out under protection, wrapped in a blanket someone had produced from a supply closet. Agents sealed the network room, the basement interview spaces, the garage log book, the key fob, the false confession still open on the laptop, the warehouse inventory system, and every phone, radio, weapon, access card, and patrol vehicle connected to the 4 names now written across Camille's clipboard. The toolbox footage from the park played on a laptop in the garage less than an hour later, showing Rourke breaking the bystander's phone, confronting 2 women without ever stating a crime, applying force, and tightening a cuff over an injury he'd been told about directly. The radio recording captured Vale's order to hold the field report and use the service entrance. The interrogation room audio, carried out on a transmitter no one in that building had known existed, captured his promise that there would be no record. The server logs captured the shutdown and the independent alert it triggered. There was no version of the night that could be called a misunderstanding. Camille had seen versions of that word used before, in other buildings, to soften things that shouldn't have been softened, and she made a point, walking the evidence table herself, of never once letting it appear in her own report. When Rourke saw Vale in restraints, he said the words that had been forming in his chest for the last hour. I was following his orders. Vale answered fast, already building distance. He acted on his own. Look at his file. You used my login, Rourke said. You had Voss walk me right past that car. Camille played the radio recording once, and the room went quiet in a way that made further argument pointless. Neither man could blame the other, without confirming his own part in it. Vale had directed and protected a conspiracy built on stolen narcotics and erased records. Rourke had been maneuvered, used, and set up to absorb the fall if the structure ever cracked. Neither fact canceled the other. Vale had never ordered Rourke to break a stranger's phone, corner 2 women on a bench, tighten a cuff over an injury, or invent a theft allegation out of nothing. Those decisions belonged to Rourke alone. Camille didn't hand down any punishment herself. She explained to Rourke flatly that his badge, weapon, radio, phone, and patrol vehicle were being seized as evidence under the federal warrant. The same badge that had given him the authority to do everything the footage now showed. The recovered Andre Coleman file went to a federal judge that evening, time-stamped, authenticated, and cross-referenced against warehouse and body camera records that had not existed in any accessible form 24 hours earlier. Nearby, an agent took down the delivery uniformed teenager's contact information from the earlier park footage. His phone was logged into evidence as Exhibit 1. Its cracked screen photographed before a replacement device and a formal statement were arranged for the following week. The first piece of evidence destroyed that day, and the first one restored. Inside the transport van, Andre Coleman watched the last light through the small rear window as the vehicle idled at a red signal 3 minutes from the detention facility gate. At 4:56, a call reached the driver. The van pulled to the shoulder. An officer opened the rear door, and for a moment Andre only stared at him, waiting for the next instruction to be another one he couldn't refuse. "What changed?" he asked. "The evidence no longer supports the case they built against you," the officer said, and began adjusting the restraints at his wrists. Andre didn't move right away, half expecting the words to be taken back, half afraid that believing them too quickly would somehow undo them. It wasn't exoneration yet. It was a stopped van, an emergency order, and the start of a review that would take weeks to finish properly. In the months that followed, investigators traced the full shape of what Vale and Voss had built, and the pattern, once assembled, was almost mechanical in its repetition. Narcotics went missing from the warehouse. An evidence label was quietly duplicated and reassigned to a new case number. A vulnerable defendant was selected to absorb the gap. Body camera footage from the relevant window was deleted on a rotating schedule designed to avoid detection. A report was written to make the movement look routine, and the original narcotics were resold through a network. Voss had spent years cultivating, the proceeds moving through intermediaries who had no idea what they were handling, had once been logged as police evidence. Complaints that came anywhere near the pattern were quietly closed inside the department. Rourke's disciplinary record, left uncorrected for years, sat waiting to be used the day the structure needed someone to blame. Financial records eventually showed the resale network stretched into 2 neighboring counties. 28 prior cases were reopened. Several convictions were vacated as the evidence in each one was re-examined against the recovered records. Marion testified in detail about the files she had spent over a year quietly gathering. Voss pleaded guilty and cooperated, trading a longer sentence for a shorter, still meaningful one. Narcotics theft, false imprisonment, and evidence fabrication among the charges that remained regardless of his cooperation. Vale's role was established through logs, recordings, financial records, and testimony that left no real room for the version of events he tried to offer at trial. Rourke's attorney argued that Vale had manipulated him from the beginning, and it wasn't entirely wrong. Character witnesses described Rourke as a difficult officer even before Vale had ever taken an interest in him. A man with 2 prior complaints for excessive force that had been quietly closed years before anyone connected them to a larger pattern. On the stand, Simone acknowledged as much herself, plainly, without hedging. Then she was equally plain about what Vale had never ordered. Not the phone shattered on the pavement. Not the choice to corner 2 women who had done nothing. Not the decision to tighten a cuff after being told exactly where it hurt. Not the theft allegation invented from nothing. Not the attempt to burn a server room rather than let the truth reach daylight. Those were his own choices, made in his own voice, and the law weighed them as such. Vale was convicted on federal charges connected to narcotics theft, evidence fabrication, obstruction, witness intimidation, and civil rights conspiracy. Rourke was convicted on charges connected to unlawful detention, excessive force, destruction of evidence, false reporting, and his proven role in the broader conspiracy. Other officers and civilian employees inside the precinct were evaluated individually, based on what each of them had actually done, rather than swept together under one verdict. Andre Coleman was formally exonerated on a gray Tuesday morning, and outside the courthouse his mother reached him before his children did, holding on to him the way people hold on to something they were genuinely unsure they would get back. His children hung back only a second before closing the distance too, and for a while no one on the courthouse steps said anything at all, the whole reunion happening in the space between people, rather than in any words spoken out loud. Later, away from any camera, he found Marion near the courthouse steps and thanked her. "You didn't even know me," he said. "I didn't know you," she said. "I knew the record they used against you was false." The city's reforms took shape over the following year. External oversight of narcotics evidence access, dual approval required before any evidence could be removed from a warehouse, 1 evidence custodian and 1 supervisor outside that custodian's chain, with a logged reason code subject to random audit, automatic off-site preservation for body camera and warehouse camera footage, permanent logs for every deletion request, independent review of any complaint touching command staff, automatic alerts whenever cameras were disabled near an active enforcement contact, protected whistleblower channels for civilian employees like Marion, a ban on any unrecorded detainee entry through a service garage, requirement that no basement interview occur without an active camera and a custody record, and an annual audit comparing officer location data against digital credential use, designed specifically to catch the kind of quiet, procedural gap that had once let a deputy chief walk 2 federal agents into a building with no official record they were ever there. None of it was announced with fanfare. Most of it arrived as quiet changes to intake software, new fields on a form, a mandatory checkbox that hadn't existed before. The unglamorous, procedural work of making the next version of that night structurally harder to build. On a warm afternoon several months later, Simone and Talia sat again on the bench beside the Hawthorne Park fountain, This time in ordinary clothes, no toolbox between them. Talia set 2 coffees down on the slats. "Do we finally get an actual lunch break?" she said. "Or is there another key fob somewhere in this park?" Simone almost smiled, running her thumb along a thin scratch in the wood where a set of handcuffs had once dragged across the grain. The mark near the fountain where the phone had shattered was gone now, worn smooth by a season of foot traffic, though Simone still knew exactly where it had been. Around them, joggers passed. A dog chased a ball across the grass, and no one glanced twice at 2 women drinking coffee on a park bench. Rourke had believed power meant making people lower their eyes. Vale had believed power lived in locked rooms and erased records. Both had been wrong, because the truth that afternoon had more than one witness and more than one way out of the building. Should every deletion, camera shutdown, or evidence access action inside a police department be preserved automatically, outside that department's own control? Let us know what you think in the comments below.